I still remember the sound more than anything else. It wasn't the jackhammer. Not at first. It was the silence that came right before it. When my neighbor stood on the edge of my property with this little grin on his face like he couldn't imagine a world where anyone would ever tell him no. 4 days later, that grin was gone, replaced by the look people get when they realize money can't rewind a mistake. Funny thing is, none of this had to happen. If he'd listened to one letter, one phone call, one simple warning, we'd probably still wave to each other across the fence. Instead, he spent almost $1 million learning where my property line really was. My name is Hannah Brooks. I'm 43 years old, and I teach history at a public high school outside Prescott, Arizona. My life has never been particularly exciting, and honestly, I liked it that way. My little house sat on just over an acre of land, nothing fancy, just enough room for a vegetable garden, a few mesquite trees, and the kind of quiet you can't put a price on. I bought the place after my divorce because I wanted one thing more than anything else: peace. Every paycheck went toward that mortgage, every weekend toward fixing something around the property. I painted the porch myself, built the raised garden beds myself, even learned how to fly a little camera drone because I enjoy taking pictures of the desert after monsoon storms rolled through. It wasn't luxury, but it was mine. And after years of feeling like my life belonged to everyone else, that meant everything. Then my new neighbor moved in. His name was Victor Langford. He was one of those men who somehow managed to announce his arrival before you ever met him. First came the moving trucks, then the luxury SUVs, then landscapers, security installers, lighting contractors, and finally a construction crew that seemed to believe the neighborhood existed solely for their convenience. People on our street talked about him the way small towns always do. Somebody said he sold a software company. Someone else claimed he owned commercial properties across 3 states. I never asked because it wasn't my business. The first time we spoke was actually pleasant enough. He walked over wearing expensive sunglasses and a smile that felt carefully practiced. He complimented my garden, asked how long I'd lived there, and joked that my little place had more character than his giant empty house. I remember thinking maybe the rumors were unfair. That impression lasted about 3 weeks. Little things started happening. Delivery trucks would use my driveway to turn around without asking. Construction workers stacked lumber close enough to my fence that I couldn't mow one side of my yard. One afternoon, I found plastic bottles and fast food wrappers blowing through my garden after a windy day. Every time I mentioned it, Victor apologized with the same easy confidence people have when they're used to problems disappearing after they say the right words. "We'll take care of it," he'd tell me. "Don't worry." But nothing changed. The neighborhood association president quietly admitted over coffee that Victor wasn't used to hearing no. "He's generous when people cooperate," she said carefully, "but he doesn't enjoy obstacles." I laughed at the time because I couldn't imagine myself becoming one. Then spring arrived, and with it came survey stakes. Bright orange flags appeared along the edge of our properties, while heavy equipment rolled in before sunrise. From my kitchen window, I watched workers measure, spray paint lines, and unload steel reinforcement bars. At first, I figured he was adding another garage or guest house. Rich people built things all the time, but something about those flags bothered me. They looked close enough that I walked inside, opened the filing cabinet in my office, and pulled out the survey I'd commissioned the year before when replacing my fence. I carried it outside, lined it up with the permanent markers buried at each corner of my lot, and felt my stomach tighten. The stakes weren't just close. They were well inside my property. I checked again. Then again, maybe I was reading it wrong. Maybe I was missing something obvious. So I called the survey company. The technician met me the next morning, took fresh measurements, compared them with county records, and after 20 minutes, he lowered his clipboard and looked at me with an expression that said he hated delivering bad news. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "they're not building on the line." He pointed toward the freshly dug trench where workers were tying steel together. "They're building on your land." For a second, I honestly couldn't speak. It wasn't a few inches. It wasn't a fence post leaning the wrong way. It was more than 20 feet of planned foundation stretching across property I'd spent years paying for. I looked over at the construction crew laughing while concrete trucks lined up at the gate, and one thought kept circling through my head. This couldn't possibly be an accident, because nobody accidentally pours a fortune onto somebody else's land. I didn't march next door screaming, and I didn't call the sheriff that morning either. Maybe that surprised people later, but anger has a funny way of making bad decisions feel like good ones. And I knew I couldn't afford either. Instead, I walked back inside. made a fresh pot of coffee, spread every document across my dining room table, and started building a timeline. Property survey, county records, closing paperwork, photographs from the previous year, every receipt connected to my fence replacement. By noon, I had a folder thick enough to make me feel a little less helpless. My attorney, Melissa Carter, looked through everything that afternoon and asked one question before saying anything else. "Have you told him?" I smiled and slid a copy of the certified letter I'd already drafted across her desk. "Not yet," she nodded. "Good. Tell him in writing. Give him every opportunity to stop. If he chooses not to, that's his decision, not yours." The letter went out that same evening. It was polite, professional, impossible to misunderstand. I enclosed the survey, highlighted the encroachment, and requested that all work crossing onto my property stop immediately until the boundary issue could be resolved. 3 days later, I received a response, but not from Victor. It came from a law firm downtown. Inside was a 2-page letter explaining that any discrepancy was insignificant and offering me $15,000 for what they called a minor adjustment between neighboring properties. I actually laughed out loud when I read it, not because it was generous, but because it told me exactly how they saw me. A public school teacher, divorced, living alone. They weren't trying to solve a problem. They were trying to price me. Melissa read the letter, folded it neatly, and looked over her glasses. "They're betting you'll blink." I asked what she would do if it were her land. She didn't answer right away. Finally, she leaned back and said, "I'd let them keep spending money." At first, I thought she was joking. She wasn't. Every additional truckload of concrete, every steel beam, every hour of labor made the situation more expensive for the person ignoring the warning. If we rushed into court before construction advanced, they might argue for a compromise. If they knowingly built after receiving written notice, the facts became much harder to explain away. So I waited. Waiting turned out to be the hardest part. Every morning I watched crews arrive before sunrise. Concrete mixers rolled through the neighborhood while backup alarms echoed off the hills. Massive forms went into place. Rebar disappeared beneath fresh concrete. Then walls began rising from the slab. Every nail sounded like someone hammering directly into my patience. More than once I stood on my porch wondering if I was making a terrible mistake by letting it continue. My friend Denise from across the street would bring over iced tea in the afternoons and remind me to breathe. "He's building himself into a corner," she kept saying. "Just don't stop him from doing it." She had lived in a neighborhood for almost 20 years, long enough to know everyone's stories. One afternoon, she admitted something I'd never heard before. Victor had fought with another neighbor over landscaping during his first year. Before that, he pressured an elderly couple into selling a narrow strip of land behind their house. Nobody had challenged him because lawsuits were expensive and most people simply wanted peace. "He thinks persistence is the same thing as ownership," Denise said quietly. "He keeps pushing until people move." That sentence stayed with me. Suddenly, this wasn't just about 20 feet of dirt. It was about every time someone had looked at another person and assumed their bank account determined who would win. Weeks passed. My little drone became part of my evening routine. Every flight was logged with the date, time, and weather conditions. I photographed deliveries, construction progress, equipment locations, and property markers. I backed everything up in 3 different places because Melissa kept reminding me that organized evidence beats emotional arguments every single time. Then came the day I knew we were finished waiting. The framing was complete. Roof trusses were stacked nearby. Expensive custom windows had already been delivered. Melissa looked over the newest photographs and quietly said, "Now." We spent the next several days preparing with the same attention Victor had devoted to construction. Licensed demolition contractors inspected the encroaching section. Structural engineers confirmed that the portion crossing my property could be removed without creating an immediate danger to surrounding structures if handled correctly. County permits were submitted. Insurance certificates were verified. Every signature was collected. Every regulation was followed. It felt almost absurd how much paperwork was required simply to remove something that never should have existed in the first place. But that paperwork became my shield. 96 hours later, the county approval arrived. Melissa called before I even opened the email. "Everything is legal," she said. "If you still want to do this, tomorrow is your day." I barely slept that night. Around dawn, I walked outside carrying my coffee and looked across the property line. The sunrise painted the unfinished building in warm orange light, making it look almost beautiful. For a brief moment, I wondered whether I should accept another offer if one came. Maybe there was an easier ending. Then I remembered the letter. The dismissive tone, the assumption that my rights came with a price tag. I pulled out my phone and called Victor myself. He answered on the fourth ring, sounding distracted. I introduced myself, even though he obviously knew who I was. Victor, this is Hannah. My demolition crew arrives in 4 hours. I'm giving you one final opportunity to stop construction and remove everything that's on my property yourself. There was silence for a heartbeat before he laughed. Not loudly, just enough to make sure I heard it. You're bluffing, he said. Nobody tears down a $500,000 project over a property line. I glanced toward the survey marker only a few feet from where the foundation crossed onto my land. I'm not tearing down your project, I answered as calmly as I could. I'm removing the part that's on mine. His voice hardened immediately. You'll spend the rest of your life in court. Maybe, I replied, but the county already has my survey. Your office signed for my certified notice, and every permit I need is approved. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he muttered, "You're making a huge mistake." I looked out across the desert where the first trucks were beginning to appear at the end of the road, their diesel engines rumbling softly in the morning air. No, I said quietly. I think the mistake was already poured in concrete. Then I ended the call before he could say another word. The demolition crew rolled in at exactly 7 o'clock the next morning. No flashing lights, no dramatic speeches, just 3 heavy trucks, a licensed foreman carrying a clipboard, and men who had done difficult jobs long enough to treat this one like any other Tuesday. My attorney arrived a few minutes later carrying copies of every permit and survey we had filed. She smiled, handed me one folder, and said, "Whatever happens today, don't argue with anyone. Let the paperwork do the talking." I nodded, although my stomach felt like it had been tied into knots. The first jackhammer roared to life just as Victor's front door flew open. He came storming across his driveway without even buttoning his jacket, his face already red with anger. "Shut it down," he shouted before he reached the property line. "You're destroying private property." The foreman calmly looked at the survey stakes, compared them to his plans, and answered without raising his voice. "Sir, we're removing the portion located on Ms. Rook's property under county authorization." Victor ignored him and pointed straight at me. "You planned this." I met his eyes and replied, "No, I warned you, more than once." For a second I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then the first section of concrete cracked with a sound that echoed across the neighborhood. And reality finally caught up with him. Within 30 minutes, sheriff's deputies arrived after someone reported property destruction in progress. Victor walked toward them with the confidence of a man who had probably solved problems this way his entire life. He talked fast, waved his arms, pointed at the machinery, then pointed at me. One deputy listened patiently while the other accepted the folder Melissa handed over. They studied the survey, compared the permit numbers, walked to the boundary markers, measured the distance twice, then quietly returned everything. The senior deputy turned to Victor and said something I'll never forget. "Sir, this appears to be a civil matter, and the work being performed is covered by valid county permits. If you disagree, your attorney is the next person you should call." Victor stood there speechless while another section of his foundation collapsed into broken slabs behind him. It wasn't satisfying because something expensive was being destroyed. It was satisfying because, for the first time since he'd arrived in our neighborhood, someone had told him that his money didn't rewrite facts. The demolition continued for 4 days. Massive chunks of reinforced concrete were cut away piece by piece until every inch crossing my property had disappeared. News traveled fast. Local reporters showed up. Neighbors gathered quietly at the ends of their driveways, pretending to walk their dogs while watching history unfold. People I barely knew began introducing themselves. One older gentleman admitted Victor had pressured him into moving a fence the previous year because he didn't want to pay another survey. A young couple said construction crews had repeatedly ignored their complaints about blocked access. Story after story surfaced, none dramatic on its own, but together they painted the picture of someone who had spent years assuming everyone else would eventually give in. On the 6th morning, Victor knocked on my door alone. No attorney, no expensive sunglasses, no confidence. He looked exhausted. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. We sat on my porch where this entire mess had started weeks earlier. After several awkward seconds, he finally said, "I want to buy the strip." I had expected that question for days. Melissa and I had already discussed exactly what my answer would be if he asked. I slid a folder across the small wooden table between us. $190,000, I said, non-negotiable. You'll also sign an agreement acknowledging the encroachment, waiving any future claims related to the demolition, and confirming that every future structure remains entirely on your property. He stared at the papers for what felt like forever. That's well above market value, I shrugged gently. So was the lesson. He looked at me for another long moment before letting out a slow breath. I suppose I earned that. 3 days later, the wire transfer appeared in my account. A month after that, construction resumed, this time exactly where it belonged. His new garage was eventually completed, larger than most people's homes and undoubtedly beautiful inside. But every time I drove past it, I noticed something most people never would. The building sat perfectly behind the property line, almost as if it had always respected the boundary that had caused so much trouble. My own life returned to normal. I went back to teaching teenagers about history, grading essays at my kitchen table, watering tomatoes after work, and enjoying quiet Arizona sunsets. The money certainly helped. I paid off my remaining mortgage, repaired the roof, started a college fund for my niece, and even took my first real vacation in years. But, if I'm being honest, none of that was the best part. The best part was waking up every morning knowing I hadn't sold my piece simply because someone wealthier assumed I'd eventually surrender it. Looking back now, I don't think this story is really about land. It's about boundaries. The invisible ones we all draw around our dignity, our principles, and the things we've worked our whole lives to build. Some people believe those boundaries move when enough money is offered. Mine didn't. Maybe you'll think I should have accepted the first offer and avoided all the drama. Maybe you'll say Victor deserved every dollar he lost because he ignored repeated warnings. I still wonder sometimes whether there could have been another ending if he'd chosen respect over pride on that very first day. So now I'd love to hear what you think. If you were in my position, would you have taken the money and walked away? Or would you have stood your ground even knowing how messy it might become? Let me know your opinion in the comments, because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle, and I'm genuinely curious where you stand.